This is Elected, a podcast for women in and around politics. I'm your host, Sarah Elder-Chamanara, and this week my guest is Asia Walker. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, the Kainai, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. So today's episode of Elected is unlike any other. We have a living encyclopedia of Calgary heritage joining Elected today. So Asia is the Heritage Resources and Research Coordinator of Heritage Calgary. She has a master's in planning from the U of C's Faculty of Environmental Design. And you have a BA honors in English, also from the U of C. Asia's interests lay at the intersection of heritage preservation and modern development, urban design, social infrastructure, and storytelling. Asia strives to lay a foundation for the exploration of all forms of heritage, our buildings, our landscapes, ancestors, traditions. Previously, Asia worked at the B&A Planning Group, the Town of Banff, and as an independent planning and engagement consultant for the Lougheed House, a national historic site. She currently serves as the co-chair for the Mount Pleasant Planning Committee. And she also knows everything about women in politics in Calgary, which is amazing. And I'm so excited. So Asia, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm so glad that we connected and are able to make this happen.
Yes, me too. So for anyone listening outside of Alberta, you're lucky your election cycles have finished. Meanwhile, in Alberta, we are still in the midst of it. Municipal elections in Alberta are being held on October 18th. And Asia reached out to me a long time ago, being like, hey, can we do something around this? And I was like, yes, let's do it. It just took me a long time to get my act together and make today happen. So thank you for your patience.
There has been a lot of stuff going on, man.
I know.
Okay. I feel like everyone's like hanging on by that thread, so this is great. This is like space for us right now. This is good.
Yeah. Well, it's great to be talking about the history of women in politics in Calgary because it is so fascinating. And even if you're listening from somewhere else and you're like, I don't live in Calgary, why is this important? It's just really fascinating. So let's dive in. Okay. So Asia very incredibly put together a lot of information. So we're going to start with some facts and stats, and then we'll kind of do a deeper dive at times on specific information. And a lot of this I'm learning myself. So we get to do this together. We get to learn together. Yeah. So first of all, 31 women have been elected to Calgary City Council, but only 30 women have actually served since the first election in Calgary in 1884. Okay, so the first question is, what happened to that one woman?
Right?
Yes, it's a mystery.
It's an enticing fact, yeah. So 31 women, yes, out of, I think we did, we pulled the records recently. I think it's something like almost 300 councillors in the history. And, 31 of them have been women. But yes, 30 have served. So in 2004, Margot Aftergood ran in the election of that year. And she ended up being accused of ballot stuffing and ended up not being able to serve on council. So that was a very intriguing little tale that happened in relatively recent history, 2004. That's not too long ago. Some of our
Do you have any details of the ballot stuffing?
Yeah, it's like a whole story. Like we could spend an entire episode talking about it.
Because in my mind, it's just like someone being like stuffing the actual ballots into the box, but I'm sure that like it might have been more sophisticated than that.
So if I remember correctly, the way it worked out is that she had, her husband had like a mail-in area within like a strip mall in Calgary. And they were mailing ballots to this post box and then capturing them. And then they were going into the count. And so there was a few people who took fall for it. She ended up being, excluded from that council, and there was a by-election immediately afterwards, which I believe Andre Chabot ended up winning. So it was a bit of a wild adventure in civic politics, and having her in the middle of it. Yeah. And then she actually ran in the last time we had an election in Ward 7 against Drew Farrell, and she lost. But it was kind of it was definitely an interesting story where, you had this 31st woman, she was elected, but with all of the kind of scandal and the clouds around it, ended up being, we like to say that she was elected, but, never having served. A month later, she had was forced to step down.
Interesting. And now I'm curious about the mechanisms that were used to make that happen. But anyways, that's like a whole it's a whole other thing that I can do the research on later. Okay, so you also have here that the Northwest Territorial Ordinance 1-1886 voided the results of the January 1886 election and stated no council existed in Calgary. So what's a little bit of the history there?
Just an interesting little quirk. There's really not a ton of information available about that, but it was an interesting fact that, a year after Calgary became, or 2 years, I suppose, after Calgary officially became a city, Alberta is not even a province yet, which is why it's the Northwest Territorial Ordinance.
Interesting.
Voided the election and said that there was no council here, and we would just continue to function as a town at the time. So no council, no governance, no nothing. So
do you know what I have a suspicion of? And I mean, I could be totally wrong, or I could be totally right, is that there was like a group of men who were like, we just don't like what's happening, and we're gonna, stop this.
Stop it. Yeah, just stop it for now. Yeah. I mean, it was a time of great tension and change out here, right? I mean, think about it, 1886, right? Who knows what could have been going on, the underpinnings and stuff like that. I mean, Fort Calgary was established. It should have been Fort Brisebois, because some guy rolled in and was like, my name is Brisebois and I want this to be my fort. And he sent this letter off, and someone wrote back and was like, no, that's not absolutely going to happen. So we could have been Brisebois, Alberta, Brisboisians, it's kind of interesting. So who knows what was going on out here?
That's a city in Manitoba?
I think so. Yeah, I think there's definitely another city. And I mean, there's Brisebois here in Calgary, right? The Brisebois Drive and stuff like that. But
so he definitely got his name on some things.
Got his wrist slapped pretty good though.
Yeah. Okay. Let's start getting into a little bit more of the into the aspect of women. Okay. Annie Gale became the first woman in Canada to serve as an acting mayor in 1923. And we proudly claim that she is the first female to serve on any municipal council in the British Empire, which at the time would be a really big deal.
Huge deal. Yeah. I mean, Annie Gale was an expat. She was originally from England. She moved here with her husband and 2 children in the early 1910s and settled in the community, what we now know as Bankview. And she was super active in all kinds of social circles in this city. She was responsible for getting the Vacant Lots Garden Club up and running, which was an interesting initiative during the First World War, where people who were interested in gardening, often instigated by women who were in their social circles at the time, growing crops on vacant lots within the city. So it was to promote food security. A lot of our produce came in from BC at the time, but there was absolutely no refrigeration, right, on these trains. And so we were buying this garbage produce. There's a quote from her saying, like, I wouldn't feed this to the cows in the old country, and yet we're here being charged exorbitant amounts for this produce. So, this local food movement was part of her, pre-council years and efforts. And she carried that on when she was on council as well. She was a big instigator of public markets, affordable food. And one of the things that she really pushed for when she was on council was the creation of milk depots in Calgary. So yeah, really safe, healthy milk that was available at a very affordable cost for mothers and children, because it was a thing that was just, we totally take it for granted now, but there was all these kind of questionable rules around, like, can you bring in milk from cows that have been vaccinated for TB? Well, is it pasteurized or not? Because pasteurization wasn't required at the time. And she really fought for that on council, and she had to push and push and push for some of these things. And it took her entire tenure on council to get, for instance, this milk depot thing through. But by the time she was finally ready to move on from council, in 1923, and she went and joined the school boards at the time, there were milk depots being set up in the city. So it was a lot of effort. No one supported her. It was really rare that any of her, public health efforts were actually supported. But she managed to keep pushing. She was audacious, and she got a lot of this stuff through in the end, which was great.
Just out of curiosity, is there anything named after her in the city?
There is a boardroom in Old City Hall named after Annie Gale, and there's a couple of them I know of that are named after other female counselors. And there is a school. There is I think it's a junior high at Annie Gale Public School. Do they know who Annie Gale is? It's a good question.
Interesting. I feel like we need to give Annie Gale some more attention, but we can talk about that after. Okay. So, let's get into some uncomfortable facts. Men have always outnumbered women on Calgary City Council. The closest we've ever come to parity is a ratio of 6-14. And you write, this was achieved several times. We never got to that mythical 50% of 7 out of 14. I mean, there is a possibility it could happen this round in 2021. But we will see on October 18th how that shakes out. Why do you think that is the case?
It's interesting. A lot of the women who I've been researching, especially early on, really advocated for parity. They expressed the importance of having women sit in these public positions. And a lot of them expressed it in terms of housekeeping, which I found absolutely fascinating. They would say that, the city is just a macrocosm of the home, and the home is ramshackle without the hand of woman, guiding and leading and stuff like that. So all of the matters that the city was responsible for at the time, things like public health, education, food security, things like this. Those are things that really are in like a woman's dominance, and they certainly were at the time. So they always argued, why aren't women more vocal and more, in these positions? Because these are things that we care about and that we know about. So why can't we just scale it up and apply it at the city level?
Yeah.
There was a lot of the articles that we read, from the Herald and stuff, this like bit of a male fragility thing going on. Like the argument was, well, if women want to do these roles so much, it must be because men aren't doing a good enough job. And the number of times women had to stand up and say, it's not that you're doing a bad job, okay? It's like, please, like you're doing, one of the women.
You're doing an adequate job.
You're doing just fine. Pansy Pugh, who was elected first in 1929, said, you guys are doing as good as you can without us. I mean.
Did she really say that?
Yes, it's a great quote.
Oh my God, I love it.
Without half the population, right? Like without half the population.
In 1929, she said that?
Yeah, it's a great quote.
Obsessed. Oh my gosh. Okay.
She's fantastic.
That's legendary.
So they really did advocate for women in these roles. But why have we never gotten to parity? Who knows? I mean, we saw stats come out the other day about the women who are running in this election, right? And it's something like 25% of candidates are female. Now we have very strong female candidates, amazing, and hopefully that will sort of bump up that parity allotment when we do get to actual election time.
Yeah.
But who knows, right? I mean, there's so many reasons, and a lot of them I think are kind of parallel, modern reasons and these historic reasons as well. So my frustration with using that one metric and focusing on it so much is that even if there was, say, only one woman running in each ward, or apply this federally, provincially, to whatever it is, whatever kind of race it is, school board, there could be one woman running, and if she wins, that's the most important metric. Yeah. Entirely correct. Yeah. And it was interesting early on, the women would put forward, I'm using air quotes, would put forward a woman's candidate. So there was one woman on the ballot, and she was supposed to be there to represent the women's needs on city council, right? This is how things sort of ended up evolving.
A slate.
Exactly, yes. And so different women's organizations would come together and pick one. And it wasn't until, it was actually quite early on, I would say. It was 1926, 1929. Edith Patterson was elected in 1926 under party politics, which were very active in the city in the early 20s. She was a labor candidate. And so very much, concerned about the unions and the labor movement in Calgary at the time, and advocated for them when she was elected to council. Pansy Pugh, 1929, came along, and she was on the civic government organization slate, which is a party that kind of arose in response to this labor takeover of council. And they were like the business side, like we're standing up for businesses and the business owners and stuff like that. So then you had suddenly two women on council who had opposing ideologies. And so then, of course, the articles that you read in the Herald are just like these women sniping at each other on council, right? And it's like they voted along party lines often, but a lot of times when it came to the betterment of the city, things like parks and schools, a lot of their interests overlapped and they would vote together. So, I mean, having like the woman's voice represented on council and having that one woman on a ballot or something like that, that's a historic trend as well. That's well established in our city at any rate. So
interesting. And Amat, just even the historical, women have to agree with each other. It's like, no, actually we can have different opinions and have different political backgrounds, but can actually also advocate at the same time for things that we have a shared interest in.
Exactly.
Who would think? Like,
who'd have thought? You can have more than one. It can be possible,
two things can be true at one time, or maybe even three.
Exactly. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, right. That's so fascinating. And okay, where was I? I'm getting off track. I'm just getting so excited and so distracted. So Annie Gale, kind of like introduction of slate. So we've got Annie Gale just as a kind of the first six: Edith Patterson, Pansy Pugh, Rose Wilkinson, love the flower names, Mary Dover, Isabella Stevens. So those were the first six women who kind of like, probably had a pretty tough time.
Can't even imagine. Honestly, I mean, Annie Gale was elected in a year where they put even a new electoral system in place in Calgary. They had moved from something into proportional representation, and nobody knew how to even count these ballots. So she had like that added sort of barrier to kind of overcome to become even, elected. She could have very well accidentally not been elected, and it would have waited another few years, right?
Yeah.
Patterson was a teacher. So a lot of these women had other careers as well. Council was certainly not a full-time job. And so she was a teacher and kept up her teaching duties while she was on council. Pansy Pugh was a businesswoman. She has this record of business and political affiliation that's phenomenal. Wilkinson was a nurse. She was a nurse for quite some time. She trained in the UK and moved here in the 20s. She was 50 years old when she was elected. She was the eldest woman who was elected to council in 1935, and her tenure is phenomenal. She was on council for 20 years. She won 10 consecutive elections because, oh my God, they would do elections every 2 years in the city, and it was... You want to know where municipal political apathy comes from? I will tell you.
Okay,
I think it's having to have elections like and they were alternating years as well. So every year we were having a civic election to replace some members of council. Another whole story. Okay. Mary Dover was incredible. She has the Order of the British Empire.
Oh.
She was a lieutenant colonel in the military, thanks to her volunteer work.
During the Second World War.
During the Second World War, yeah. And then when that ended, was bored probably, came here and set up shop as a alderman at the time. And then, Isabella Stevens was a legal editor. She had a 46-year career as a legal editor. She raised 2 children. She was a Governor General recipient and received a doctoral, honorary doctorate from the University of Calgary. Phenomenal. And these women are quoted in the paper as Mrs. Herman Stevens. So they were called after their husband's first and last names at times. So, they're phenomenal in their own right. But these six women between 1917 and 1959. And then we have this drought. There is between 1959 and 1971, no women sat on council. It's like we were gaining momentum, things were kind of coming along. And then there's just this drought where no women were elected. And
were women running?
That's a good question. So trying to find out even whether or not they were running it, the archives and digging into this kind of stuff is difficult. I found maybe 3 names of women who were candidates, but then not elected. But this kind of gap in the period of time is something that we're going to be digging into soon, because I mean, I think one of the obvious likelihoods that it could have been is that it was this post-war period. Men were returning home, women were returning to the home. And it was just more of a male-dominated environment again, the public sphere, right? Where the private sphere was much more of women reclaiming their dominance within the home. So it could be a reason. It's just a hypothesis at this point in time. Well, but yeah,
that's interesting. So so Isabella Stevens, who was the 6th woman to ever serve on Calgary City Council. Her term you have listed as 1952 to 1953, and then 1955 to 1958. 1958 was not that long ago, and she was only the 6th.
Yes. Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, I think that it probably shows a good trend. I mean, if there was 6 before 1958, and then, the remaining number, don't make me do this math, 24, like after, 1971, it shows a really good upward trajectory, right? So it shows that we are moving in the right direction. But you're right. I mean, like 4 decades, 6 women on council. I mean, yeah, a lot of it comes down to those things that we have already sort of referred to, like one woman is enough, and that kind of shows over the time, right? You'd have one woman leave, and then they'd be like, well, who's going to replace her?
Who's the one woman who can do this job? The token woman.
Possibly be 2 or 3, right?
Heaven forbid.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's break it to a little bit of a more modern place in Calgary's history. So Barb Scott served for 24 years, which in politics is a very long time. And then we actually have 2 current councillors who are hot on her heels for following up on that record. Councillor Diane Colley-Urquhart has served 21. She is currently running for re-election. Councillor Drew Farrell has served 20 years. She is not running again. So she is done as of October. And you think, so potentially Diane could overtake that record if she is reelected.
Yeah, that's correct. So she will probably, depending on whether or not she's reelected, she will overtake that 24-year because we're now in these 4-year cycles, right?
Yeah.
And Diane, Drew Farrell will match Rose Wilkinson, who was, again, 20 years on council. Now, Drew has not won as many elections as Rose Wilkinson did because they were having them so frequently, right? I mean, Rose, like I think I said, won 10 consecutive elections in a row, which is phenomenal, and sat for 20 years. But yes, those 2 are tied. And then Barb Scott, 1971, 1995. And then, yes, the likelihood will be that Diane will overtake that record should she be reelected and serve her full term.
Okay, so now let's get to a stat which has gotten some media attention before, which is that in the history of Calgary, there have been more men named John elected to city council than women in general.
Yeah.
So how many Johns have there been?
This is a sad stat. And I did have to end up grouping, like if they have John in their name, so first or middle name. So I'll give that little bit of concession there. There is 41 men in the history of council who have had the name John somewhere in their name. David John Russell, John Jeffrey Hanna, John Schmall, John Joseph Lee. John Creighton died in 1902, and John Kerr was acclaimed as his alderman. So like a John replaced a John.
I wonder if he got a bump because of that, and people were like, I'm just confused. Maybe I'm just going to vote for John again.
John sounds good. Bring John in. Like, that's fine.
That's a solid choice.
And John's not the only one. There's 28 Jameses and 28 Williamses as well who have been elected. So they're close. They're runners up to the 30 women who have served on council. That's a lot. And then there's like some James John Bell and William John Hunt who kind of are categorized in both.
That's so interesting. And then let's fast forward to where was it? So not only the Johns is very interesting, but I'm getting lost in my facts. Let's talk about, so I'm really curious, not being from Alberta originally, and I got here and I was like, oh, there's so many things I don't understand. Why do we have two school boards, for example? Why are our counselors called aldermen? Like it really, I'm going to say it really pissed me off that there was a man in the title and alder. And I was like, why? And that has since changed. But can you explain, like, where did that title come from and why did it take us so long to ditch that really antiquated title?
Very good question. So alderman is an inherited patriarchal East Canada British thing that had just been, adopted into the mechanisms of creating the city of Calgary since its inception all those years ago. In the early 2000s, maybe even a little bit earlier, I would say, the argument, the discussion started coming up exactly as you say. Why do we continue to use this term when we have, women on council? And maybe, who knows, because this stuff is, the women is not documented, so this stuff is not documented, but maybe there were men who didn't identify as men and who are being called aldermen on council, right? Yeah. So the argument was made, Madeleine King, who was a councillor, she was first elected in, where are my facts now? 2001. Alongside the eminent Drew Farrell, Madeleine King had this argument as well. She said, and she really championed this all in her time all the way through. She said, why do we still have this? And the backlash she got about this. Oh, well, if Madeleine King wants to change alderman to alderperson or alder whatever, or to change it entirely, well, is she going to change her patriarchal last name? Is she going to be Madeleine Queen or Madeleine Peasant or something? Like the arguments were insane, right? Like the pushback and the backlash about people who wanted to keep that traditional title in place rather than, change it to something else was remarkable. And it had always been alderman. I kind of referenced this earlier. It was when these women were quoted in the paper from the 10s, 20s, 30s, it was alderman, Mrs. last name. So it was very clear to the reader that it was a female who had voted this way or that way.
Did they do the same thing for men? Did they say alderman, Mr.?
No, it was just alderman, and then they would have their initials. So like JJ, so like John. John. That's how they would state those. So, and you can see this on a plaque.
Heaven forbid you would assume you would just, actually know someone and who they were.
Exactly. And you can see this on a plaque, actually. The 10th Street Bridge was commemorated and opened while Annie Gale was on council. And you've got Mr. R.J. Johnson, Mr. W.H. Williams, and then Annie Gale.
Really?
So she doesn't even have the alderman title there. It's just her name. It's just Annie Gale. So anyways, coming back to this, alderman versus
I feel like that could be fixed with a Sharpie.
Right? I think, or like some sort of art bombing or something. Yes. We would ever
not that I would ever do that after work today.
Just like slap a sticker on it.
Yeah.
So it did finally change. In December of 2010, council voted to change the title from alderman to councillor to be more inclusive. Not without fighting, not without infighting too. There were women on council who said, no, like, why would we change this? This is just right. This is creating a mountain out of a molehill. Forget it. It took a long time. And then the change did take effect eventually in October 2013 during that civic election.
Yeah. That's, well, sometimes there are also women who actively, go against our own interests, which
don't want to.
That's another episode.
Don't want to, shake the whatever, just keep your head down, sort of thing. Yeah.
Okay, so let's do a quick rundown then of some fast facts in terms of just some general first. So first woman councillor Annie Gale, 1917. The first Black woman elected to Calgary City Council was Vernetta Anderson in 1972. That's a huge first.
It was, yeah. And she served one term. Vernetta was, again, one of those women who were active in so many social circles. I think she was the CEO. She started Meals on Wheels in Calgary. Mm-hmm. She was part of different religious, auxiliary groups and things like that as well. Phenomenal, though. Talk about your glass ceiling being broken. She was married to a Calgary Stampeder, Sugarfoot Anderson.
You mean like a Stampeder football player?
Yeah, a football player.
Okay.
Yeah. And he was
that's my non-sports side showing through. Because I'm like, was he in a rodeo or was he on a football team?
Good call. No, he was a very good Stampeder football player at the time. And she was married to him and she was elected, 1972. There has not been a great, as much as we talk about how devastating it is that we are in 2021 and there's only been 30 women who have served on city council in a city that's 137 years old. The diversity has certainly been lacking across the board, not just for women. So.
Right. And that's a really important part of the discussion. So, which leads us to the first and only Métis woman who has ever served on council, Yvonne Fritz, in 1989.
1989.
And there has never been a First Nations female councillor in the history of Calgary City Council. And
not that we know of. And we should be very clear about this too, because archives are so spotty as it is. They're currently closed as well. So being able to dig into some of this stuff has been challenging, to say the least. And a lot of the times, people didn't identify as such, right? They kind of kept those things close to their chest. Ward Sutherland's a really great example. He has learned about and come to embrace his Métis heritage in his time on council, but had no idea that he was, Métis before his time serving on city council. So there may very well have been female councillors who have identified in any sort of way, right? And there's just no way of us to really know it. And again, another reason why this kind of research, this ongoing work is I find it to be super important. So we can find that recognition. But as we understand it right now, yes, no First Nations, no Indigenous women or no First Nations female councillors who have sat for city council. Again, might change this time around. In my ward, Ward 7, Marilyn North Pagan is running to be councillor to replace Drew Farrell. So we will see.
Yeah. No, there could be an epic shift in terms of the makeup of City Council on October 18th. And then we have one other first and only South Asian woman councillor that's currently Jyoti Gondek, who is running to be potentially Calgary's first female mayor outside of Annie Gale, who was our only acting male. So she would be, that would be an epic first.
It would be. It would cross boundaries. I mean, the first woman who ran for mayor was Sue Higgins, who was a councillor in 1983. So before that, we have no record of a woman running for mayor for the top chair, which is remarkable.
Well, and I mean, it was just even in 2017, there weren't any women who ran for mayor.
No.
So
it's been a journey. The closest a woman has ever come to being elected mayor was Bev Longstaff. She ran in 2001 and she lost by 4,000 votes. So who knows how the cityscape would be different. Bev championed public transportation. She was like pro bike lane before bike lanes were even like in the common vernacular. She hated sprawl. She absolutely hated the way the city was growing and wanted everything to turn kind of inwards and focus on what we call now this kind of idea of gentle densification. So more townhomes, more, walk-up apartment buildings, more backyard suites, things like that. In 2001, I mean, this stuff became more common in the planning vernacular, thanks to Nenshi and the councils that have come with him, and just, the evolution of planning and how a city should be built, I suppose. But she was, before her time, a lot of these women were. A lot of the women through the 70s and 80s were very much focused on the pedestrian experience about how women, go figure, get around the city, right?
Well, and how we do it safely.
Exactly. Yeah. You walk down the street. My favorite one is on 14th Street. You come up 14th Street, you got a 1.5 meter wide sidewalk, and there is a power pole in the middle of the sidewalk. you can't go on one side because there's a wall. You can't go on the other side because there's speeding vehicles. And what do you do when you get halfway up that probably icy hill in the middle of winter with a stroller and a toddler?
Or a wheelchair.
Or a wheelchair, or crutches, or an elderly person just trying to, walk a block from, where the bus stop lets off to their home. Women have a more inherent understanding of this because we take shorter trips, we take more frequent trips, and we visit more places around the city. It's just the way it is because of the way that, childcare works out, parental care works out, running errands, picking things up, dropping things off. If these women had their say and had these ideas implemented a little bit more readily earlier on, who knows what the city would look like that we live in today. So let's
elect more women.
Let's elect more women. Exactly.
Let's elect more women, because it is really hard, I think, in the Calgary context, and seeing, like, it's frustrating for me and thinking about, and then hearing these things and thinking, like, how would the city be different? If we had different people making these decisions and having different conversations, and, we have so much untapped potential in terms of who we are as a city and who we are as a community, of 1 million plus people. And that's why October 18th is really important.
Extremely important.
Extremely important. So super fascinating. I'd love to have you back to do another episode, maybe after the election, and then we can talk about how things have changed.
I think that's a great idea. Yeah, it would be fantastic to come back, talk a little bit more about, the way that decisions were made in this election, try and find some parallels from the past, because the best way, I think, to figure out how we can situate ourselves in the future or situate ourselves in the present in order to see where we're going in the future is to find common parallels from the past and see what happened, what worked out, what didn't, and what can we learn from that, right? Yeah. So I think that would be fantastic.
Well, and maybe we can each have like a little bottle of potentially, hopefully, if I'm expecting it's going to be a celebration, we can like toast, we can have little like virtual
Amazing.
Cheers.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah, to like women getting elected on Calgary City Council.
Maybe we'll finally hit that parity too, hey? Like so many firsts that could be happening this time around, and lots to celebrate one way or another. So
I'm excited.
I think that would be great.
I'm excited. Okay. So thank you so much for joining me today, Asia. We will definitely do this post October 18th, hopefully with champagne in hand, and, celebrating all of the ceilings that we will break. I'm just going to say will instead of hopefully. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you for being this encyclopedia of history in Calgary, and we're so lucky to have you.
Working on it. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the time.
You're very welcome. So this has been another episode of Elected. Thanks for joining us today. Until next time.